Let's see if we can actually find a match. Okay, so
good luck and fair seas.
I think I'm gonna go sea just because they don't have a battleship.
Good luck and fair seas.
Yep. That side's probably gonna fall apart first, and the aircraft carrier is on that side. Yeah, I think that's gonna be the course of action to go.
Enemy force sighted on the horizon.
Come on, edge a little bit closer. Probably gonna be too late, but ooh, got one. He's got his acceleration boost going.
Enemy submarine spotted.
Oh, it penned. It's not very common that you can pen a destroyer with a battleship.
Enemy battleship sighted.
I do not have the armory San Antonio, Arizona. Watch out, Penske.
Engine boost activated. Enemy destroyer detected. Enemy battleship sighted. Enemy cruiser detected.
Let's see if we get lucky. Nope.
submarine in sight.
Well, that's bad time to drop.
Our team has taken the lead.
We've destroyed an enemy cruiser.
2 citadels.
Enemy battleship sighted.
We've spotted an enemy submarine. Our victory is in sight.
Alright, let's take out this German battleship before he can get over and reinforce that side.
Engine boost activated. Our victory is in sight. Engine boost activated.
Enemy aircraft carrier sighted. Enemy destroyer sighted.
Torpedoes to port. Hull breach. We're taking on water quickly.
That was a
Critical
good
engine
airdrop.
damage. Problem solved, sir. Enemy severely damaged.
This aircraft carrier's gotta go. can't do the whole sit there and talk and talk and talk and talk with no one talking back. Most histories of the apartheid's end focus on Nelson Mandela, or Robben Island, on the township uprisings, on international sanctions, and the moral weight of the global anti-apartheid movement. All of these things mattered, but there is another part of the story, fought in the red dust of Angola and the flat thorn bush of Namibia, far from the cameras, and the protests, and the Nobel Prizes, that has never quite received the attention it deserves. For 23 years, the South African Defense Force fought a grinding, escalating, ultimately unwinnable war along its northern borders. It started as a counterinsurgency against a Namibian liberation movement. It became a full-scale conventional war involving Cuba, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the largest military engagement on African soil since the Second World War. And when it ended, when South Africa finally withdrew from Angola and acknowledged Namibian independence, the apartheid state withdrew something else too: the confidence, the military myth, the belief, along with the white South African public and the Afrikaner leadership, that the regime's survival could be guaranteed by force. Oliver Tambo, the leader of the African National Congress, called the battle that finally broke that myth the Waterloo of racist South Africa. He was not wrong. South Africa in the 1960s was a country under pressure from every direction. The United Nations had condemned apartheid. African nations that had once been under European colonial rule were gaining independence and providing bases for the liberation movement, fighting South African rule in Namibia and South Africa itself. And the apartheid government had a framework for understanding all of it, a framework called total onslaught. Total onslaught was the theory that South Africa was the target of a coordinated communist campaign directed from Moscow, working through the African National Congress and SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, fighting for Namibian independence, to destroy white minority rule. The theory was partly true and largely exaggerated. The Soviets were backing both movements. Cuba would eventually deploy tens of thousands of troops to Angola and South Africa's conflict zone. These were real facts. The framework of an existential global communist conspiracy was an exaggeration layered on top of them. But it served a political purpose. Framing the border wars as South Africa's front line against communism achieved two things. It justified military spending and conscription to the white South African public, and it attracted American support at a time when Washington was deeply anxious about Soviet expansion in Africa. The immediate trigger was Namibia, Southwest Africa as South Africans called it. South Africa had administered the territory since taking it from Germany in 1915 during World War I. It had extended apartheid there as thoroughly as it had at home. The SWAPO had been formed in 1960 to fight for independence. When diplomacy and legal efforts through the United Nations produced nothing, SWAPO formed a military wing, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, LAN, And in August 1966, PLAN fighters attacked Portuguese trading stores in southern Angola. The South African border war had begun. For the first decade, it was manageable. SWAPO was small, lightly armed, and operating from bases in Zambia. The South African security forces were vastly better equipped and contained the insurgency. But in 1974, everything changed. Portugal's colonial empire collapsed overnight. The new left-wing Portuguese government withdrew from Angola, leaving a power vacuum in which three armed factions immediately moved. One of them, the MPLA, backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, ultimately took power. And the MPLA gave SWAPO something it never had before: a massive, friendly, well-equipped northern neighbor directly bordering the border war became a regional war, and South Africa decided it needed to fight it. South Africa's war in Angola was not a secret. It was reported. It was known in broad outline. It was discussed in Parliament. What was kept from South African public was the scale, the cost, the truth of what was happening on the ground. In 1975, South Africa launched Operation Savannah, a full-scale conventional military intervention in the Angolan Civil War, driving north towards Luanda alongside UNITA rebels in an attempt to prevent the Cuban-backed MPLA from taking power. The column got within range of Luanda. Then the Americans, who had encouraged South Africa to intervene, lost their nerves. Congress passed legislation blocking further U.S. involvement in Angola. South Africa was left exposed, withdrew, and watched MPLA consolidate power with Cuban military support. The lesson South Africa drew was the wrong one. Not that unilateral military adventure in Angola was unwinnable, but the next time they needed American support locked in before they committed. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, South Africa conducted a series of massive military operations, driving deep into Angola to destroy SWAPO's forward operating bases. The operations were military successful in narrow tactical terms. SWAPO's bases were destroyed, its Crandalls killed and forced north, but each destroyed base was rebuilt. Each operation produced more SWAPO recruits from the Numidians, who watched their homeland bombed and bleeding. And each operation entrenched South Africa equal in a war that had no exit strategy for. The South African conscripts who fought these operations were not professional soldiers. They were 18 and 19-year-old white South African men doing conscriptory national service. 2 years initially, with regular
Ship is on fire!
3 years afterwards. They were told they were fighting communism on South Africa's border. Many of them came home with what the army called negative states, PTSD and everything but name, and they were told to say nothing until they had seen it. The war was being fought, and the white South African public were being asked to support it, without being fully told what it was or what it would cost. Through the early 1980s, that worked.
Problem solved,
But
sir.
by the late 1980s, it was starting to break down. In 1987, the Angolan government army, the FAPLA, launched another offensive
Engine boost
against
deactivated.
UNITA's
Torpedoes
strongholds.
Torpedoes, dead ahead.
South
Below the
Africa
waterline. We're
began
flooding quickly.
as a head
Ship is on
support,
fire.
stopping the offense until the river in a series of engagements in September and October 1987 that destroyed several Angolan bridges. FAPLA fell back to the town of Quito Carnival. South Africa and the UNITA followed, besieged the town. What happened next changed the war. Fidel Castro made a decision that South Africa had not anticipated. Rather than allow Quito Carnival to fall and lose everything Cuba had invested into Angola over a decade, Castro decided to massively reinforce. Between December 1987 and March 1988, Cuba poured 50,000 additional troops into Angola, bringing its total force to 55,000 men. More critically, Cuba deployed advanced MiG-23 aircraft and sophisticated anti-aircraft systems that fundamentally changed the air balance over southern Angola. The South African Defense Force had operated with effective air superiority throughout the border war. Its Mirage and Impala aircraft have been able to strike SWAPO and FAPLA positions with relative freedom. That superiority ended with the Cuban reinforcements. South African pilots began encountering MiG-23s they could not outmatch, and anti-aircraft defenses they could not easily suppress. South Africa launched 3 major assaults on Cuito Carnival in January, February, and March 1988. All 3 were repulsed. The town did not fall. And simultaneously, Cuba moved a powerful Western force towards the Namibian border, a direct threat to South Africa's control of the territory it was fighting the entire war to protect. The military outcome of Cuito Carnival is fiercely disputed. South Africa insists it was never defeated, that its forces held their objectives, and that the battle was a tactical stalemate. Cuba and Angola claim a decisive Cuban-Angolan victory. Nelson Mandela, who was still imprisoned on Robben Island when this happened, later said, "The defeat of the apartheid army was an inspiration to the striking people of South Africa and to all Africa." Objectively, military historians have generally concluded the battle was a strategic stalemate in tactical terms, but that the strategic consequences were entirely in Cuba's favor. South Africa found itself facing a conventional military threat on the Namibian border that it could not easily counter, at a cost it could not sustain, in a war the white public was losing patience
All
with.
forces, capture that area.
The Tripartite Accord was signed on December 1988. South Africa agreed to withdraw from Angola and implement UN Resolution 435 on Namibia independence. Cuba agreed to withdraw its forces from Angola. The deal was brokered by the United States, the same United States that had quietly supported South Africa's intervention while publicly maintaining arms embargo compliance.
Enemy force
Namibia
detected.
became independent on March 21st, 1990. SWAPO Sam Nujoma, who had run the liberation movement from exile for 3 decades, became its first president. South Africa had fought for 23 years to prevent exactly this outcome. It had failed. To understand how the border wars broke apartheid, you have to understand how they worked on the white South African public. The constitutionality the regime needed to maintain order to survive. Apartheid rested on a compact with white South Africans. We provide you security, prosperity, and separation from the black majority. In exchange, you support the system. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, that compact held. The economy grew, white living standards were high. The military appeared in control of the borders. The black population was suppressed. The border wars slowly dismantled that compact from multiple directions, simultaneously. The financial cost was staggering. South Africa's defense budget consumed an ever-growing share of government spending through the 1970s and 1980s. Money being spent in Angola rather than on infrastructure and services that maintained white South Africa's quality of life. By the late 1980s, military spending combined with the economic damage of internal sanctions had produced serious economic deterioration. The rand collapsed in value. Inflation rose. The prosperity that was the system's central promise had eroded. Then there was the conscripts. 500,000 white South African men who had served in or adjacent to the war zone. Many had seen things they couldn't speak about. Classified operations, the reality of what the war entitled. And what had come home changed. The End Conscription Campaign, formed in 1983, began organizing white South African men to resist call-ups. Some refused and went to prison. The movement was small, but its existence was significant. White South Africans were publicly refusing to
We've
fight the
spotted an enemy
government's war.
submarine.
Quito Carnival made all this
Enemy
worse.
cruiser
The
sighted.
military myth, the South African Defense Force was an invincible force protecting South Africa from communism, had been central to the regime's legitimacy. When the battle ended in a withdrawal and a negotiation settlement that gave Namibia its independence anyways, the myth was punctured. South Africa had spent
Enemy
23
battleship
years
sighted.
and enormous blood and treasure to prevent Namibian independence. It had achieved nothing. The strategic logic of the border wars had always been that the military success in the north would buy time and space for the apartheid system to survive. By 1989, that logic
Ship is
had
on fire.
collapsed. The Cubans and the Soviets had matched South Africa militarily. The economic cost was becoming unsustainable. The white public was tiring, and the ANC's internal resistance, the township uprising in
Problem solved,
1976 and 1985, had demonstrated that the black population would not be permanently suppressed. FW took power in August 1989. He was not a reformer by conviction. He was a pragmatist who could read the strategic situation his predecessors had created. The military had not secured apartheid. International isolation was deepening. The economy was deteriorating. And Quito Carnival had demonstrated that even military superiority could not be assumed. On February 2nd, 1990, de Klerk stood before the South African Parliament and announced the unbanning of the ANC and the release of Nelson Mandela. 9 days later, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison after 27 years. The South African border wars killed approximately 2,000 South African soldiers, roughly 12,000 SWAPO fighters, and tens of thousands of Angolan citizens caught in the war between the large powers. It consumed hundreds of billions of rand in military spending. It conscripted 500,000 young white South African men, many of whom came home with wounds, physical and psychological, that the government preferred not to acknowledge. What it achieved, strategically, is one of history's most bitter ironies. South Africa fought for 23 years to prevent a communist-backed liberation movement from taking power in Namibia. It failed. SWAPO governed Namibia from independence in 1990 and has governed it continuously since. The MPLA, which South Africa fought to undermine in Angola, remained in power. The Soviet Union, whose global ambitions have provided the ideological framework for total onslaught, collapsed in 1991, making the entire doctrine retrospectively moot. But the border wars did something their architects did not intend. They accelerated the end of apartheid itself. The military cost, the economic drain, the demoralization of the white conscript generation, the puncturing of the SADF's invincibility myth at Quito Carnival, all of it combined with the internal resistance and international pressure to produce a government that, by 1989, understood it could not continue. Nelson Mandela understood the connection.
General quarters.
When he was released in February 1990, one of his
Good luck
first public
and fair
statements
seas.
honored the Cuban forces that had fought in Angola. The Cuban people hold a special place in the heart of the people of Africa, he said. The Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom, and justice, unparalleled for its principle and selfless character. It was a statement that many in Washington found uncomfortable, but Mandela was making a very specific historical argument. The battle that broke the apartheid regime's military confidence had been fought with Cuban soldiers, Soviet weapons, and the liberation movements of southern Africa, not by the superpowers whose diplomacy eventually managed the transition, but by the men and women who had died in Angola bush for a cause they believed in. Apartheid did not fall from the outside. It was hollowed out from within, by its own wars, its own cost, its own contradictions. The border wars were one of those instruments of that hollowing. Not the only one, but one of the decisive ones. The war that ended apartheid was the war that the apartheid government had been fighting to save itself.
Enemy force sighted on the horizon.
Concentrate fire on the designated target.
Right now, August 1st, 2026, Spain is in the middle of a crisis. 60,000 people have crossed from Morocco into Ceuta, a small piece of Spanish territory that sits right on the Moroccan coast. Spain declared a state of emergency. The city, which normally houses around 85,000 people, was completely overwhelmed. Most news coverage is treating it as an immigration story, but it is also something else, a pressure
Enemy
campaign,
destroyer sighted.
a political message. And to understand who is sending that message and why, you need to know the background, because the timing of this crisis is not random. It happened the same week as Morocco's King's anniversary celebration. The same week, the US reaffirmed its support for Moroccan territorial claims. The same week, Israel's ambassador to the UN publicly mocked Spain on social media.
Torpedoes to starboard.
That's a lot of coincidences. Let's break it down.
Enemy destroyer sighted. Enemy battleship sighted.
Torpedoes to starboard.
Spain has two cities that sit on the coast of Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla. They both have been Spanish for centuries. Melilla since 1497, Ceuta since 1580. Spain considers them part of Spanish national territory, like any other Spanish city. Morocco disagrees. It has always considered these cities to be Moroccan land held
Concentrate
by a
fire on
foreign
the
power.
enemy warship.
Morocco wants them back. For decades, this has been mostly a simmering dispute. Morocco complains, Spain ignores it, and not much happens. But over the last few years, Morocco has gotten significantly more powerful friends. And those friends are now helping Morocco apply pressure on Spain in ways that were not possible before. The two most important of those friends are the United States and Israel.
Enemy destroyer detected.
In 2020, the Trump regime brokered a deal. Morocco agreed to formally recognize
Torpedoes,
Israel,
get ahead.
which it had never done before. In exchange, the United States recognized Morocco's claim over Western Sahara, a disputed territory to Morocco's south, that the UN considered a separate, non-self-governing territory. That deal changed the entire regional picture.
Enemy cruiser
Morocco
sighted.
went from being a country with a modest military to being one of the best armed nations in Africa. Israel started supplying Morocco with advanced drones, missile defense systems, and military technology. The two countries signed a formal military cooperation agreement. By early 2026, they had held multiple joint military meetings
All
in
stations.
Tel Aviv.
Reporting the position of a strategic
For the
target.
United States, Morocco is valuable for a simple reason. It sits right at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea, controls the Atlantic approach to Europe, and has enormous mineral resources, including rare earth minerals that the U.S. needs for its technology and defense industries. In February 2026, Washington and Morocco signed a memorandum for exploiting those minerals. In April, they agreed a 10-year defense cooperation roadmap. Morocco is now, functionally, a military partner to both the United States and Israel. And Ceuta and Melilla, the Spanish cities on Morocco's coast,
Enemy
are
battleship
right in
detected.
the middle of all this. Spain has been doing things that make it very unpopular with the US-Israeli-Morocco alliance, and the timeline matters. In October 2025, Spain imposed a complete arms embargo on Israel in protest of the war in
Enemy
Gaza.
destroyer detected.
It was one of the strongest positions taken by the European government. Then, Spain refused to take part in or allow any of its territory to be used for US and Israeli military operations against Iran. The US reportedly considered suspending Spain from certain NATO privileges over this. Pete Hegseth publicly called out European allies who wouldn't cooperate with the Iran campaign. Trump himself called Spain terrible. And then, on July 20th, 2026, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez flew to Algeria. This was a big deal. Algeria and Morocco are bitter rivals. They have a long-running feud over Western Sahara, where Algeria backs the independent movement that Morocco is trying to crush. Spain and Algeria have been on bad terms since 2022, when
Concentrate
Spain
fire on the
supported
enemy
Morocco's
warship.
position in Western Sahara. By making up with Algeria, Spain was signaling that it was stepping back from the pro-Moroccan position it had taken 4 years earlier. Morocco was furious, and 10 days later, the border at Ceuta was opened. The timing
All
is almost
stations,
impossible to
fire on
separate
the
from
designated
politics.
target.
Israeli UN ambassador Danny Danon, who represents a country that had just been embargoed by Spain, posted on social media mocking Spain's crisis. He called Ceuta and
Fighter
Melilla
returning to ship.
colonial enclaves in Africa, and suggested Spain had no business criticizing Israel. Spain's transport minister looked at that post and responded publicly. Well, it all seems to be becoming quite clear. A U.S. think tank called the Middle East Forum, tied to Marco Rubio, published a piece in March 2026, openly calling for Morocco to send people with bulldozers into Ceuta, raise the Moroccan flag, and claim the territory. The same outlet published an Israeli opinion piece recommending Israel use its influence in Washington to help Morocco take back Ceuta. None of this is secret. These people are saying this out loud.
All stations,
To
reporting
be
the
clear
position
about
of a
what we know
strategic
and what we
target.
don't, no one has produced a document proving that the United States or Israel told Morocco to open the Ceuta border. That is important to say. What is documented in public statements, signed agreements, and the words of the people involved is this. The United States has given Morocco military support, diplomatic cover over Western Sahara, and a 10-year defense partnership. Israel has given Morocco advanced weapons and military cooperation. Morocco has openly used the Ceuta border as a pressure lever against Spain before, and admitted it. Spain has refused to join U.S.-Israeli operations against Iran, embargoed Israel, and just visited Morocco's biggest rival, and in the same week as Morocco's national celebration. As the U.S. reaffirmed its support for Morocco, and as Israeli diplomats were publicly mocking Spain, 6,000 people crossed that border. The incentive structure is clear. Morocco has every reason to squeeze Spain right now, and has powerful friends backing it up. Spain is isolated. The U.S. that is angry at it for not supporting its war in Iran, and Israel that it had embargoed over a genocide in Gaza, and a Morocco that wants its cities back. Whether anyone in Washington or Tel Aviv made a phone call is something we may never know for certain. But the countries that could have told Morocco to keep that border closed didn't. And the countries that could have stopped this from happening chose not to. That is the story. That is all the moving parts. Make of it what you will. After the main exploded, a single diver had gone down to examine the wreck, or a single witness had testified before the naval court. Before any physical evidence had been gathered or analyzed, William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal published his verdict. Spain did it. The headline ran across the full width of the front page. Below it, a detailed account of the explosion, complete with diagrams, illustrations, and expert opinions, all pointing to a Spanish mine. None of it was based on an investigation. All of it was based on what sold newspapers. In part 1, we told you the story of what happened. In part 2, we're going to tell you what actually happened, and how the most powerful newspaper proprietors in history used 260 dead sailors to manufacture a war. To understand what happened to the coverage of the Maine, you have to understand the men who covered it, and what they were fighting over. By 1895, two of the most powerful newspaper proprietors in American history were locked in a circulation war of extraordinary ferocity. Williams Randolph Hearst, heir to the California mining fortune, had bought the New York Journal in 1895 and immediately began poaching Pulitzer's best reporters, editors, and even his comic strip characters. Joseph Pulitzer, who had built the New York World into the largest circulating newspaper in the country, responded by matching every escalation. The two papers drove each other towards more sensational coverage, bigger headlines, more dramatic illustrations, more emotionally charged language. Cuba, where a genuine and brutal conflict was unfolding, was the perfect story for this kind of journalism. It had real victims, real villains, real drama. All it needed was amplification. Hearst amplified it systematically. He sent his best writers and the celebrated illustrator Frederick Remington to Cuba to cover the story. The most famous anecdote of this period, perhaps of all American journalism history, is the alleged telegram exchange between Remington and Hearst. Remington, finding Havana quiet and the expected drama absent, supposedly cabled Hearst, "Everything is quiet. There is no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return." And Hearst allegedly replied, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Hearst denied the exchange ever happened. No original telegram had been found. Historians have debated the story's authenticity for decades. But here's the thing. Whether or not Hearst actually sent that telegram, it actually described what his newspaper did. The Journal sent reporters to Cuba to find a war. When the war was quieter than expected, the Journal ran stories as if it weren't. When Spanish atrocities were real, and many were, the Journal amplified them beyond any documentary basis. And when the Maine exploded, the Journal responded not as a news organization trying to determine what had happened, but as a campaign organization that had already decided what had happened and needed the facts to catch up. The day after the explosion, the Journal ran a $50,000 reward offer from Hearst personally for information leading to the conviction of the criminals who destroyed the Maine. A reward for convicting criminals whose existence had not yet been established, for a crime that had not yet been investigated. The verdict was in before the trial began. The newspaper coverage of the Maine's destruction was not merely sensational. In many cases, it was fabricated. Within days of the explosion, the Journal had published detailed diagrams of the Spanish mine that had allegedly sunk the Maine, including its design, its placement, and the mechanism by which it had been detonated. None of this was sourced to any investigation. The diagrams were illustrations, not evidence. The confidence with which they presented was total. The World, not to be outdone, published its own expert analysis of how the mine had worked.
Enemy force sighted on
It
the
quoted
horizon.
naval officers, often without their names, often with their statements taken out of context or simply invented, to support the mine narrative. Headlines like "Main explosion caused by bomb or torpedo" ran with question marks that the surrounding text did not honor. The stories themselves asserted Spanish culpability as a established fact. Meanwhile, the actual Naval Court of Inquiry was reaching a more complicated conclusion. The court's findings did find evidence consistent with an external explosion, a section of the hull that appeared to be bent inwards rather than outwards, suggesting that force had come from outside the ship. On this basis, they concluded that a mine was a probable cause. But the court also found significant evidence that complicated the picture.
Ship is on fire!
The pattern of damage to the ship was not entirely consistent with the standard mine. No mine fragments were recovered. No evidence of a mine cable
Problem
or
solved,
anchoring
sir.
mechanism was found. And critically, the Spanish investigation concluded simultaneously, reaching the exact conclusion. Internal explosion, no mine. One voice that cut through the noise at the time was the New York Times, which was not participating in the Yellow Press competition. The Times ran a measured editorial 2 days after the explosion, suggesting the cause was likely
The ship is on
accidental.
fire!
It was ignored. The Times was outsold by the journal The World by ratios of 10 to 1 in the weeks that followed.
Enemy destroyer sighted.
The official investigation's conclusion that a mine had caused the explosion was accepted by the public and the government, not because the evidence was conclusive, but because the newspapers had spent weeks making any other conclusion seem naive.
Problem
or
solved,
cowardice.
sir.
To doubt the mine theory was to be soft on Spain.
The ship is
But
on
for more
fire!
investigation was to dishonor the dead. President McKinley's own court of inquiry, in his official report, explicitly declined to assign blame. That disclaimer was buried. The mine was amplified to a Spanish atrocity. That investigation for Maine was not the last word on the Maine. The wreckage was investigated 3 more times. Each
Get us
time,
a
the
start.
political context of the investigation shake its conclusion. In 1911, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers raised the Maine's wreckage from the bottom of the harbor.
Problem solved,
A
sir!
second board of inquiry examined the
Ship is on
newly
fire.
accessible remains. It reached essentially the same conclusion as 1898. External explosion consistent with a mine. The wreck was then towed out to sea and sunk in deeper waters. Any further physical examination. Historians and naval engineers spent the following decades building problems with the mine. The most fundamental was thermodynamics. The pattern of damage to the Maine's hull was inconsistent with how mines of that era behaved. Mines created a specific signature of explosion, a bubble of gas expanding against the hull, creating characteristic damage patterns. The Maine's damage did not match those patterns cleanly. There was also the question of motive and logic. Spain was desperately trying to avoid war with the United States in early 1898. The McKinley administration had been pressuring Spain to reform its Cuba policy, and Spain had been making concessions. Blowing up an American warship in Havana Harbor, Spain's own port, under the eyes of witnesses, would have been the most irrational act Spain could have possibly committed. It guaranteed the war that Spain was trying to prevent. In 1974, and then more definitively in 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover, one of the most technologically distinguished naval officers in American history, the father of the nuclear submarine program, conducted a private investigation of the Maine using modern analytical methods. His team applied computer modeling, heat transfer analysis, and the accumulated knowledge of a century of marine engineering to the available evidence. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The Maine was almost certainly destroyed by an internal explosion, a coal bunker fire. The ship's coal bunkers were in direct contact with their forward ammunition magazines, a known design flaw of ships of that era. Had the igniting magazine, and it produced 2 explosions that witnesses described. Coal bunker fires were not unusual in steam-powered ships of the 1890s. They were a documented hazard, caused by a spontaneous combustion of a certain type of coal under a certain type of storage conditions. The Maine had been using a type of coal known to be prone to this problem. She had experienced elevated temperatures in her coal bunkers in the days before the explosion, a detail that the original court of inquiry had noted and not
Battle
pursued.
starts.
Rickover was careful with his phrasing. He said, almost certainly. The evidence was not absolute. No definitive proof of exactly what happened could be established after the wreck had been disturbed by 2 previous investigations and sunk in deep waters. But his conclusion was that of the weight of evidence strongly favored internal explosion, and that the 1898 investigation had reached the wrong conclusion under immense political pressure to find an external cause. The Yellow Press did not cause the Spanish-American War alone. The underlying conditions, the Cuban crisis, The genuine atrocities of Spanish reconcentration policy, the American appetite for imperial expansion, the McKinley administration's diplomatic failures, all of those were real. The war might have come regardless, but the Yellow Press determined the timing and the pretext. It took an unexplained explosion and converted it, within 48 hours and without evidence, into a Spanish act of war. It drowned out the voices, including Captain Sigsbee's own voice, from the deck of the ship that had just blown up, calling for suspended judgment. It made a political cost of a peaceful resolution too high for McKinley to pay, even when his own diplomats were telling him Spain was about to meet the American demands.
Enemy
First
force
understood
detected.
exactly what he had done. The war was declared. He ran an editorial in the journal underlying his own byline. "How do you like the journal's war?" it asked. The journal's war killed 3,289 Americans. It killed an unknowable number of Spaniards. It handed the Philippines to a new colonial power that fought a brutal 9-year counterinsurgency war against the population it had normally liberated, killing somewhere between a quarter of a million and a million Filipinos. It established the template for American imperial expansion that would define the next half-century of foreign policy. In 1976, 78 years after the explosion, 3 years after the end of Vietnam, a year after the Church Committee had revealed the CIA's covert operations, and the public was in a mood to reassert official narratives, Admiral Rickover published his findings. Full bunker fire. Internal explosion. No Spanish mine. No Spanish attack. The investigation that should have been done in 1898, done properly without political pressure, had finally been done. Its conclusion was that the war had begun with an accident, and that the accident had been converted into a casus belli by men who understood that a confused public, given a clear and satisfying villain, were not asked too many questions. They were right. The public did not ask too many questions. The war came, the empire came with it. The men who built the narrative, Hirsch, Pulitzer, whose names today adorn a journalism award and a university, died rich and celebrated. The lessons of the USS is not that government always lies about the cause of wars, though sometimes they do. The lesson is simpler, more durable than that. The lesson is what happens when the institution responsible for questioning official narratives decide instead to build them. When the press stops asking, what actually happened, and starts asking, what story will sell? The public loses the one tool it has to evaluate whether the war being proposed in its name is built on solid ground. In 1898, the tool failed completely. 260 American sailors were dead, and before anyone had established why, their deaths had been converted into a war. Remember the Maine. Just remember it accurately.
The enemy team has taken the lead.
At 9:40 on the evening of February 5th, 1898, the United States battleship Maine detonated in Havana Harbor. 2 explosions in rapid succession. The forward section of the ship was obliterated. 3/4 of the crew, 260 men, were killed, most of them asleep in their berths in the bow. The survivors were thrown into the dark water. The ship sank in minutes. Within hours, America knew. Within days, America had decided who was responsible. Within 10 weeks, America was at war.
Enemy battleship sighted.
Whether that decision was right, whether the destruction of the Maine was actually caused by Spain, or by something else entirely, is a question that investigators have revisited 3 times over the following 80 years. The answers have changed each time. The war it started cannot be undone. This is part 1, the sinking, the investigation, how the death of 260 sailors became the spark for America's first imperial war. To understand why an American warship was sitting in Havana Harbor on February 15th, 1898, you have to understand what had been happening in Cuba for the last 3 years before it. Cuba had been a Spanish colony for 4 centuries. By 1895, Cuban rebels had launched a full-scale independence war, the third major uprising against Spanish rule in 30 years. Spain's response was led by General Valerio Weyler, whom the American press immediately christened Richard Weyler. Weyler introduced a policy of reconcentration, forcing the Cuban rural population into fortified camps to deny the rebels their civilian support base. 300,000 people were herded into these camps, denied adequate food, water, and medicine. Tens of thousands died of starvation and disease. In the United States, the reaction was outrage, genuine, widespread, and commercially useful to the newspaper industry. American business interests in Cuba were substantial, roughly $50 million in investments by 1898. The Cuban conflict had disrupted trade, and politically, a growing faction in Washington, led by figures like Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt and Senator Harry Lodge, argued that America's moment to project power beyond its own border had arrived. Cuba was 90 miles from Florida. Spain was a declining empire. The opportunity was obvious to those who wanted to see it. In January 1898, riots broke out in Havana. Cuban loyalists attacked Spanish reform advocates in the street. President William McKinley, who genuinely wanted to avoid war and had been pressing Spain to reform his Cuban policy, made a decision intended as a gesture of goodwill to measure pressures simultaneously. He sent the USS Maine to Havana. The Maine arrived on January 25th. The captain, Charles Sigsbee, anchored her in the harbor, exchanged courtesies with Spanish authorities, and settled in what was expected to be a routine diplomatic presence. The Spanish were not pleased, but were too diplomatically weak to protest effectively. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The Maine sat in the harbor. The crew went about their routine. Captain Sigsbee wrote letters home. Then, the night of February 15th arrived. The first explosion was relatively small. A sharp crack that the survivors were later described as a lifting sensation. A pop. Then, a fraction of a second later, the second explosion. Enormous. Catastrophic. The forward magazine of the Maine detonated and a fireball tore the bow completely off. The sleeping men in the forward berths had no chance. They were the enlisted crew. The officers were quartered further aft and survived in far higher proportions. Of the 374 men aboard, 252 killed outright or died of their wounds in the following days. 8 more died later, bringing the final toll to 260 American soldiers. Captain Sigsbee survived. He was in his cabin, writing a letter when the explosion hit. In the chaos that followed, fire on the water, the ship settling rapidly, and in the harbor, he maintained enough composure to send an immediate telegram to Washington reporting the disaster. His message included a sentence that would be largely ignored in the following days. Public opinion should be suspended until further report. Washington did not suspend public opinion. The press did not suspend public opinion. Within hours of the explosion, before any investigation had begun, before any evidence had been gathered, the narrative was already forming. Spain had done this. Two investigations were launched almost immediately. the United States convened a naval court of inquiry, beginning its work within days of the explosion. Spain simultaneously convened its own investigation. The Spanish investigation concluded that the explosion had been internal, an accident originating inside the ship. Their divers and engineers examined what they could of the wreck and found no evidence of an external line. They argued that the pattern of the explosion was consistent with an internal magazine detonation, rather than an underwater device. Nobody in America paid much attention to the Spanish investigation. The findings of the enemy were not considered reliable evidence in a case where that enemy was already being tried in the press. The American Naval Court of Inquiries reported its findings on March 28, 1898, 6 weeks after the explosion. Its conclusion? The Maine had been destroyed by an external underwater mine. The court explicitly declined to assign blame. Its members stated they could not determine who had placed the mine or whether it had been placed deliberately, but the conclusion that a mine was responsible was itself enough. In the political climate of March 1898, an external mine meant Spain. The court's careful disclaimer about blame was lost in coverage. The headline was mine. The implication was Spain. The conclusion that the public and the press drew was the conclusion that the press had been preparing for them to draw for months. President McKinley received the report. He had been one of the last men in Washington genuinely trying to find a diplomatic solution. He had been pressing Spain to grant a Cuban autonomy. Spain had been making concessions, slowly, reluctantly, but making them. McKinley's own advisors told him Spain was close to meeting American demands without a war. It didn't matter. The pressure from Congress, from the press, from the public opinion was overwhelming. In April, McKinley asked Congress to authorize the use of force to intervene in Cuba. Congress went further. It passed a declaration of war. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted less than 4 months. It was, by military standards, almost comedically one-sided. The Spanish Navy was antiquated and outclassed. In the Philippines, Commodore George Duay destroyed the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet in a single morning, without losing a single American sailor. In Cuba, the Atlantic Fleet annihilated the Spanish squadron at the Battle of Santiago Bay. On land, American forces, including Theodore Roosevelt's celebrated Rough Riders, fought their way up San Juan Heights and broke Spanish defensive positions. Spain sued for peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, ended 4 centuries of Spanish imperial presence in the Americas and the Pacific. Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and, for $20 million, the Philippines. The United States, which had entered the war claiming to fight for Cuban independence, emerged from it controlling territories across the Caribbean and the Pacific. Cuba gained nominal independence, but remained effectively an American protectorate for decades. The Philippines, which had been fighting its own independence war against Spain, found itself fighting a new political instead. America. The Philippine-American War, which followed, killed between 250,000 and 1 million Filipinos. All of it's traced back to a single night in Havana Harbor. 2 explosions, 260 dead American sailors, and a question that nobody in the rush to war had waited to properly answer. What actually caused those explosions?
Ship is on
In
fire!
Part 2, the evidence that the Maine was not sunk by Spain. The newspapermen who built the narrative before the investigation had finished, and the question of whether America went to war
Ship is on fire!
They did not begin with gas chambers. They began with words. Life unworthy to live. Burdensome lives. Useless eaters. Mercy death. Before a single person was killed, the Nazi state spent years building the vocabulary. Clinical, bureaucratical, almost compassionate sounding. That would make what came next feel like policy rather than murder. And then, in October 1939, Adolf Hitler signed a document, backdated, so it would appear to have the authority of wartime necessity, authorizing his physicians to grant mercy deaths to those deemed incurably sick. The program had an address, Tiergartenstrasse 4, Berlin. They called it, simply, T4.
Enemy cruiser detected.
Medical forms were sent to every psychiatric hospital, every asylum, every institution housing disabled people across Germany. Doctors were required to fill them out for every
Enemy
patient.
battleship sighted.
The forms were reviewed by committees of physicians who had never met the people they were assessing. They reviewed paperwork. They checked boxes. They signed their names. Patients were loaded into gray buses with painted over windows so no one could see inside. They were told they were being transferred to better facilities. Their families were told the same. They were driven to one of 6 killing centers, ordinary-looking buildings in ordinary towns. The first method was starvation, then lethal injection. Then, when the numbers grew too large for those methods, sealed rooms filled with carbon monoxide. The same engineers who designed those rooms later built the gas chambers at Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Between 200,000 and 300,000 people, children, adults, the elderly, anyone the state had decided cost more than they contributed. They called it health measure. They called it compassion. They called it science. Bishop Clemens von Galen of Münster, one of the few voices in Germany who said it plainly, stood before his congregation in August 1941 and called it what it was: murder. The regime paused the program after his sermon. The killings continued in secret until 1945. The last child killed under T4 died 3 weeks after American troops had already occupied his town. No one had told the staff to stop.
Problem solved, sir.
There are governments today, right now, in the world you live in, debating the forced institutionalization of people with disabilities. The language has changed. It always changes. It is never murder. It is never elimination. It is care. It is protection. It is management. It is cost efficiency. It is placement for the benefit of the individual and society. The Nazis did not invent the idea that disabled people were a burden on the state. They inherited it from a broader eugenics movement that had supporters in many countries. What made T4 unique was not the ideology. It was the willingness to act on it.
Problem solved, sir.
The question that historians ask of every generation is not whether they have avoided the ideology. It is whether they have built the institutions, the legal protections, political will, the cultural insistence on human dignity that prevent that ideology from becoming policy. The people killed under T4 were not killed by monsters. They were killed by physicians, by administrators, by committee members who signed forms and collected salaries, and went home to their families. The bureaucracy of murder does not require extraordinary evil. It requires ordinary people following policies that have been made to sound reasonable. The first step is always language. The language that divides people into productive and unproductive. The worthy and the unworthy. The ones whose lives have value and the ones whose lives are a cost to be managed. That language is not new. It is not gone. It is very good at sounding like something else. The German delegation arrived at the Palace of Versailles on June 28, 1919, knowing exactly what they were about to sign. They had been given the treaty's terms 6 weeks earlier, and had spent those weeks filing written objections, 443 pages of them, that the Allied powers largely ignored. Germany's newly democratically elected head of government, Philipp Scheidemann, had already resigned rather than put his name on it. He called the treaty a murderous plan, and said he would rather lose his hand than sign it. His successor was sent to this place, because the alternative presented by the Allies was simple and brutal: sign, or the war resumes. When the German foreign minister, Count von Brockdorff-Rantzau, received the terms in May, he addressed the Allied leaders directly. "We can sense the full force of hatred that confronts us here," he told them. "You demand from us to confess we were the only guilty party of the war. Such a confession in my mouth would be a lie." They signed anyways. They had no choice. What they signed would strip Germany of 13% of its territory, 6 million of its people, all of its overseas colonies, its entire navy, and most of its army. It would demand reparations equivalent in modern terms to hundreds of billions of dollars. And it would formally declare, in writing, before the entire world, that Germany alone had caused the war. Jean Maynard Keynes, one of the most important economists of the 20th century, who attended the conference as part of the British delegation and resigned in protest of what he saw, called the treaty a Carthaginian peace. He warned that it would destroy the German economy, destabilize European politics, and make another war not merely possible, but likely. He was right on all three counts.
Action stations.
The peace treaty was shaped by 3 men above all others, each pulling in different directions, and the document that emerged was the product of those competing tensions, which is to say, it was the worst possible combination of all three positions. Woodrow Wilson had come to Paris with his 14 points, a framework for a just and lasting peace built on national self-determination, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations that would resolve future disputes without a war. Wilson believed Germany could be reformed rather than punished. He believed an amalgamation peace would produce a stable democracy. He was also increasingly ill, politically weakened at home, and systematically outmaneuvered by men who had been doing European politics since before he entered the academia. Georges Clemenceau had watched German armies invade France twice in his lifetime, in 1870 and in 1914. He had lived through the siege of Paris. He had seen what German industry and military power could do when unleashed against France. He was 78 years old, had survived an assassination attempt, and was operating from a simple
Enemy force
conviction:
detected.
Germany had to be weakened so completely and so permanently that it could never threaten France again. He called Wilson's 14 points naive. God himself was content with 10 commandments, Clemenceau reportedly said. Wilson modestly proposes 14. David Lloyd George occupied the uncomfortable middle, personally skeptical of the harshest treatment, privately worried about what Keynes was telling him about the economic consequences, but politically constrained by a British electorate that had just returned him to power on the promise of faith. Squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeak, one of his colleagues had said during the electoral campaign. The British public wanted punishment. Lloyd George delivered it while occasionally flinching. Germany had signed the armistice on November 11, 1918, expecting a negotiated peace based off Wilson's 14 points, which had been publicly endorsed by the Allied powers. What arrived instead was a document their delegation was given no meaningful opportunity to contest. Presented, as the Germans immediately pointed out, not as a negotiated treaty, but as a dictated one. They called it Der Diktat. The word stuck. Of all the weapons embedded into the Treaty of Versailles, none cut deeper into Germany's national consciousness than Article 231. The War Guilt Clause, as it was immediately and permanently nicknamed, did not use the word guilt. Its authors were careful lawyers who understood they were writing a legal instrument. What it did was require Germany to fully accept responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. This was the legal foundation for determining reparations. If Germany caused the war, Germany owed compensation for its cost. To ordinary Germans, and to the German government, and to most German historians, the clause was a lie, not a contested interpretation, a lie. Germany had not started the war alone. The July crisis of 1914 had involved the miscalculations, mobilization orders, and belligerence of Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, and Britain, as well as Germany. The idea that a war involving every major European power had been caused solely by one of them was, at a minimum, a profound distortion of a complex historical process. Germany spent the next 15 years trying to prove this. The Weimar government released nearly 60,000 official documents in an attempt to demonstrate that the war's guilt was shared. By the 1930s, most serious historians outside of France had concluded the responsibility for 1914 was indeed collective. The clause was, in the judgment of much of the academic world, historically indefensible. But it was in the treaty, signed, permanent, and it was used to justify everything else. Because if Germany had caused the war, Germany owned the cost of the war, and the cost of the war was a figure so large it stunned even the men who said it. The Reparations Commission met in 1921 and fixed the total at 132 billion gold marks, approximately 33 billion US dollars at the time, or the equivalent of roughly $400 billion today. John Maynard Keynes had already told the British government the figure was economically insane, that the German economy simply could not generate sufficient export surplus to make transfers of that magnitude, and that trying to force it would destroy not just Germany, but the European trading system that Britain itself depended on. Germany did not finish paying these reparations until October 3rd, 2010, 92 years after the war ended. The last payment was 70 million euros in interest on bonds issued in the 1920s. The war that ended in 1918 was being paid for in the 21st century. The territorial terms were designed with deliberateness that went beyond the requirements of the post-war adjustment. They were designed to hurt. Alsace-Lorraine, the province Germany had taken after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, returned to France. This was broadly accepted as legitimate, even by many Germans. But the Polish corridor was different. A strip of German territory was carved out and handed to the newly reconstructed Poland, giving it access to the Baltic Sea, and in the process, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany entirely. The city of Danzig, overwhelmingly German in population, was made a League of Nations free city rather than give to Poland or return to Germany. The Rhineland, German soil, was demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops as a buffer zone. Germany's overseas colonies in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific were stripped away and handed to Allied powers as League of Nations mandates. The pretense was international administration. The reality was that Britain and France absorbed most of them into their own empires. Germany's colonial territories were not liberated, they were redistributed. And then there was the military. The German army was reduced to 100,000 men. The figure so small that it could not defend Germany's borders, let alone threaten anyone else's. No tanks, no aircraft, no submarines. The General Staff, the intellectual center of Germany's military thinking for a century, was dissolved. The German Navy was to be surrendered to the British. When German naval officers learned their fleet would not be returned, they scuttled 50 ships at Scapa Flow on June 21st, sending the German high seas fleet to the bottom of the ocean rather than handing it over. It was the largest deliberate scuttling of warships in history. The British were furious. The Germans considered it an act of honor. It was also a preview in its defiance, in its nationalism, in its absolute refusal to accept humiliation passively of what was coming. The Germany that signed the Treaty of Versailles was not the same Germany that had fought the war. The Kaiser had abdicated. The empire was gone. In its place stood the Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at democracy. A government born of the chaos of military defeat, immediately saddled with the political consequences of a treaty it had no hand in negotiating. This was not accidental. The Allied powers required Germany's new civilian democratic government to sign the treaty. The military leadership that had actually fought the war, Field Marshal Hindenburg and General Ludendorff, who had commanded the German armies, walked away from the defeat with their reputations largely intact. The democratic politicians who signed the armistice and the peace treaty were immediately having stabbed Germany in the back, surrendering a war that the army had not actually lost on the battlefield. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth, was false. Germany had lost the war militarily, its armies exhausted, its reserves depleted, its allies collapsed one by one, its home front near revolution. But the myth was politically irresistible. It gave the German right narrative. The army had not been defeated, it had been betrayed. And the men who betrayed it had signed the diktat. The Weimar Republic spent its entire existence trying to govern under conditions the treaty made nearly impossible. The reparation burden consumed German fiscal capacity. When Germany fell behind on payments in 1923, France and Belgium invaded and occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to extract payments directly. The German government responded by printing money to pay striking workers who refused to collaborate. The result was hyperinflation in 1923, which wiped out the savings of the German middle class in a matter of months. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice daily and sent their wages home by messenger before money lost its value. A real barrel of banknotes would not buy a loaf of bread. The middle class, the social backbone of any functioning democracy, was economically annihilated. The economy stabilized in the mid-1920s with American loans, but the Great Depression of 1929 destroyed the fragile recovery. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed. The democratic parties that had governed the Republic were discredited by their association with the diktat and by their inability to protect the ordinary German from economic catastrophe. The political extremes, communist on one side National Socialists, on the other, grew with every election. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had made his political career on a single promise. He would tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore German honor. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles had been chosen deliberately. In January 1871, following France's crushing defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, Otto von Bismarck had chosen that room, the grandest room in the grandest palace in France, to proclaim the new German Empire. It had been France's most humiliating moment of the 19th century. The French chose the same room in 1919 to dictate the peace terms to Germany. The symbolism was intentional. The message was clear. The circle of humiliation had been completed. Jean Maynard Keynes resigned from the British delegation and went home to write The Economic Consequences of the Peace, one of the most prolific books of the 20th century. He warned that the treaty would impoverish Germany, destabilize European politics, and produce conditions in which dangerous political movements would flourish. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, he wrote, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. Even some of those who negotiated the treaty recognized, almost immediately, what they had done. Harold Nicholson, a young British diplomat at the conference, wrote in his diary he felt ashamed of the terms, and that the German delegation's distress at signing was painful. Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, who had actually won the war militarily, looked at the treaty and said, "This is not a peace, this is an armistice of 20 years. He was wrong by only 65 days. World War II began 20 years and 65 days after the treaty was signed. Hitler did not come to power because of the Treaty of Versailles alone. The rise of Nazism had multiple causes: economic depression, institutional failure, the specific pathologies of German nationalism, the cynicism of conservative elites who thought they could use Hitler and control him. No single cause produces a historical catastrophe of that magnitude. But the Treaty of Versailles provided the fuel. It gave a furious, humiliated, economically desperate population a genuine grievance. A peace that genuinely had been unjust, genuinely had been punitive beyond any economic logic justified, genuinely had been designed as much to humiliate as to secure. Hitler did not invent the German rage at Versailles. He found it, already burning, and threw everything he had on the fire. The statesmen at Paris in 1919 were not stupid men. They had been warned by Keynes, by their own advisors, by the German delegation's 443 pages of objections, what the consequences of their choices might be. They chose anyways. Clemenceau wanted Germany broken. He got what he wanted. And 20 years later, what he had broken came back together under the worst possible leadership and tore the world apart again. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the Hall of Mirrors, June 28, 1919, did not merely fail to prevent the Second World War. By most serious historians' assessment, it made it nearly inevitable. Field Marshal Foch called it an armistice of 20 years. He should have been remembered as a pessimist. Instead, he was almost exactly right. In the spring of 1854, a newspaper editor named Sherman Booth rode on horseback through the streets of Milwaukee, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Freemen, to the rescue. Slave catchers are in our midst. Be at the courthouse at 2 o'clock. By that evening, several thousand people had gathered outside the Milwaukee County Jail. Booth gave a speech. The crowd surged forward. They battered down the jail doors with a wooden beam. And Joshua Glover, a man who had been born enslaved in Missouri, who had escaped to Wisconsin 2 years earlier, who had been dragged from his home by federal marshals the night before, walked out of that jail a free man. He made it to Canada. He was never recaptured. What followed from that single night, the arrest, the trials, the defiance of an entire state, and a Supreme Court confrontation that reached all the way to the edge of the Civil War, became one of the most extraordinary legal battles in American history. This is the story of a law so unjust that a free state refused to obey, of a Supreme Court that said they had to, and of a state Supreme Court that looked at that ruling and filed it in the trash. To understand what happened in Wisconsin, you have to understand the law that started it. The original Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 required the return of escaped slaves to their owner. By the 1840s, it had been largely ignored across the northern states, which had passed their own personal liberty laws, making enforcement difficult or impossible. Slave owners were furious, and in 1850, as part of a broader political compromise designed to hold the fragile Union together, Congress passed a new version, strengthened, federally enforced, and designed